So we ask ourselves, where does self-concept come from? And one of the most important subjects that we'll deal with in this program. We know that every child comes into the world with no self-concept at all. That every single idea, every single attitude, value, feeling, belief that we have as adults, we did not have when we were born. That every single concept that we have of who we really are, we had to learn during the course of growing up. That each child comes into the world as pure potential, like a complete white sheet or a white slate with nothing written on it. And that a child, in terms of self-concept, can develop and go in any direction depending upon what happens to them after they're born. We know that when the child is born, the child has an extremely high need for love and touching. The child comes into the world as pure sensation, and the child begins to develop their sense of self by the way he or she is responded to by their parents. A child learns whether or not he or she is lovable or acceptable or worthwhile or funny or intelligent or talented or capable by the way he or she is treated by their parents. In fact, the child has no self at all and looks into the faces of the parent to determine whether or not he or she is lovable. The child, being pure sensation, needs love and touching like roses need rain. It is impossible to give a child too much love in the formative years. Children need a constant, continuous flow of high-quality love in order to develop healthy personality. Some of the old school ideas that let the child cry or you'll spoil him, spare the rod and spoil the child, children should be seen and not heard. These ideas were and are, if you like, prehistoric notions of child raising. The fact is that we know today that children need love as much as they need food, as much as they need shelter, as much as they need clothing. In several experiments that took place, some in the early part of this century, some as recently as the late 40s, they took children who were born and placed in state hospitals and divided them into two groups. One group of children was given continual holding, talking, touching, loving, singing, warmth, support. The second group of children had their diapers changed and were given bottles, but were never spoken to, were never held, were never sung to, and received no emotional support at all. In one experiment, which had to be stopped, and it was stopped too late, 90% of the children in the second group actually shriveled up and died of grief within the first 90 days after birth. This has been called the infant grief-death syndrome, which is in the psychology textbooks. Children who are deprived of love in the formative years actually fail to grow and sometimes shrivel up and die like leaves that have fallen off a tree in the fall. The need for love is so crucial that we know that all of healthy personality is based on it. We know that the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years of a child's life are absolutely the most crucial for laying down adult personality. That almost all psychosis, all totally, if you like, uncurable mental illness can be traced back to a breakdown of the flow of love in the first year of life. That if the flow of love breaks down in the second year or the third year or the fourth year, it will cause serious personality problems, neurosis, sometimes psychosis, schizophrenia, behavioral problems, and personality disorders. But if a child has an unbroken flow of high-quality love in the first 3 to 5 years, the child will be set down on a solid foundation and will be able to go on to realize their full potential. If a child does not receive high-quality love in the first 3 to 5 years, the child will develop what Abraham Maslow called deficiency needs. Just like a vitamin deficiency, if we are deprived of vitamin B and calcium in the formative years of our lives, children develop rickets. And the rickets causes their legs to bow, causes their bones to be weak, and for the rest of their lives they'll have bowed legs. Children who are deprived of love also have the same psychological deficiencies, and for the rest of their lives they spend much of their time trying to compensate for their deficiencies rather than realizing their potentials as human beings. We also know some other things about the developing child. We know that the child is born with two marvelous characteristics. The first characteristic is that every child is born fearless. Every child is born totally unafraid. In fact, when a child comes into the world, they only have two fears. One is the fear of falling, the other is the fear of loud noises. All other fears that a child learns, all adult fears that we have to be taught to us as children and taught to us over and over again by a process of repetition. The fearlessness of the child is characterized by the words, I can. I can do anything Children are totally unafraid of trying anything. Anybody who's ever raised a small child to the age of 4 or 5 knows that you have to spend the first few years of their life stopping them from killing themselves. Children are totally suicidal. They're kamikaze. They're totally unafraid of anything. They'll throw themselves off of heights. They'll run out into traffic. They'll sit on hot stoves. They do not know enough to fear anything. Our natural state of nature is to come into the world with no fears at all. And when we look at the fears that are the great robbers of our adult lives, we must remember that every single fear that we suffer as adults we learned after birth. The second characteristic that children have is that they're born totally spontaneous, completely uninhibited, which is characterized by the words, I don't have to. Children feel that they don't have to do anything, that they can do anything they want and they don't have to do anything they don't want. What is the first word that a child learns? It's no. And the second word a child learns is don't. And who teaches the child those words? The parents, by saying no and don't continually. The child learns very early that I don't have to do anything. They laugh, they cry, they throw themselves on the floor, they have tantrums, they suit themselves completely. Our natural state of nature is to be completely unafraid and completely uninhibited in our relationships with ourselves and with other people. And if you will look upon your adult experiences, whenever we find ourselves in a situation where we are completely safe and completely relaxed and we are with good friends in an area that we know very well, we revert back to our feelings and our actions of being totally unafraid and totally uninhibited. In other words, we become totally ourselves. We know also that children learn 2 ways in the formative years. The first way they learn is by imitation, usually of one or both parents. And if one parent is more dominant than the other, then the child imitates the dominant parent. And many of our adult habit patterns and characteristics come from straight imitation of one of our parents in our formative years. For instance, we find that adults who are early risers, who get up at 5:30 or 6 every morning whether they need to or not, almost invariably the father in the family was an early riser. Many parents have had the experience of shouting at one of their children and hearing their own mother or their own father's voice come out of their mouth. And sometimes when your children grow up, you hear them shout back at you, and they shout back in your voice and in your words. Many of the characteristics we say, like father, like son, like mother, like daughter, it's very, very true. Many of our beliefs, many of our attitudes, many of our values as adults were simply imitated totally and without change from the way our parents thought and acted and behaved during our formative years. We look upon our parents as gods. They are the primary role models for us as children, and we look to them to learn how to walk, to talk, to speak, to think, to react, and everything. The other way that children learn in the formative years is by moving from discomfort toward comfort. What Freud called the pleasure-pain principle. We move away from what is painful toward what is pleasurable. We move away from what is uncomfortable toward what is more comfortable. And these 2 ways, imitation and moving from discomfort toward comfort, are the key ways that we learn throughout life. Of all the discomforts that a child can suffer, the most traumatic of all is the withdrawal or the threat of the withdrawal of love and approval from the parent. If the parent threatens to withdraw love or withholds love, the child actually suffers psychic trauma. There is nothing more terrifying to a child than to think that his or her mommy or daddy does not love them. Children need love so desperately that if parents use the threat of the withdrawal of love, what we call love deprivation or love withheld, children will very soon lose their natural spontaneity, their natural fearlessness, and they will do everything possible to conform to the wishes or the demands of their mommy and daddy so as not to suffer that incredibly terrifying discomfort of loss of love. Children need that love so badly that they will do anything to get it. And when parents mistakenly use love withdrawal or love deprivation to manipulate their children's behavior, they find a very interesting thing. It works very well. Throughout the generations, parents have found that if you withdraw love or use love as a tool to manipulate your children's behavior, it's very effective. But the great tragedy is that it causes psychic trauma and deep psychological scars that then manifest themselves in adult lives and create deficiencies that adults spend the rest of their lives trying to compensate for. Let me explain. Very early in life, usually by the age of 2 to 2.5, as the result of mistakes that parents make in upbringing, especially destructive criticism and physical punishment, children begin to learn negative habit patterns, which then carry over into adult life. Negative habit patterns are always learned as a result of fear, as a result of the repetition of a process of fear, punishment, destructive criticism that causes the child psychic discomfort, if you like, and often psychic trauma. Very severe punishment, very severe traumatic events can cause children to carry negative habit patterns into adult life that actually require psychotherapy and counseling to overcome. But the basic negative habit patterns that children learn and children develop, that we are all subject to in our society because of the way we've been raised, are first of all the inhibitive negative habit pattern. Now, an inhibitive negative habit pattern is characterized by the words, I can't, and is caused when children are subjected to punishment and are told over and over again, don't, get away from there, stop that, leave it alone, put that down, don't touch that. How many times have I told you, leave that alone? When the child, who is naturally curious and spontaneous and interested and who wants to touch and taste and feel and get into things, doesn't understand that the parent is being inconvenienced, or understand that they are breaking something or damaging something that causes expense to the parent. All the child understands is that whenever I try to touch or taste or smell or feel or get into something new or different, my mommy or daddy get angry, they don't love me, they spank me, they criticize me, they punish me. It must be because I'm too small. It must be because I'm incompetent, I'm incapable. I can't. Later on in life, when the child or the adult is asked to do something that entails risk or involvement or trying something new or different, the instinctive reaction is, I can't. And you can tell when you are in the grip of a negative habit pattern, because all negative habit patterns are manifested physically. You can feel them in the physical body, and the inhibitive negative habit pattern is manifested down the front part of the body. The first place you feel the inhibitive negative habit pattern is in the solar plexus, when your solar plexus tightens up and your stomach starts going queasy, and sometimes your heart rate speeds up and your respiratory rate speeds up. Sometimes your throat gets tense. Sometimes you get inflamed sinuses or headaches in the front part of the head. Sometimes your bladder releases and you have to run to the bathroom. The inhibitive negative habit pattern causes us an irrational feeling of fear and anxiety and trembling that is not based on external stimuli. For instance, many people are uneasy about public speaking. If you ask them to get up and speak in front of a group, very often they will go through all of the traumatic physical manifestations of the inhibitive negative habit pattern. Their stomach will seize up, their solar plexus will tighten up, their heart rate will speed up, they'll start breathing rapidly and trembling, exactly as though they were in terrible physical danger. The inhibitive negative habit pattern leads very early in life to what we call the fear of failure. And the fear of failure is the greatest single obstacle to success in adult life. The fear of failure is what holds more people back from exploring their full potential than any other negative habit pattern or any other factor in human personality. This fear of failure is what arises inside of us whenever we are given an opportunity to risk our time or our money or our emotion. We feel immediately, I can't. Many of us whose parents were brought up during the Depression remember our parents saying over and over again at a young age, I can't afford it. And we grow up as adults, and very often whenever we are exposed to the opportunity or the need to spend something or make a buying decision, we have exactly that same inhibitive negative habit pattern. I can't afford it. It tightens up, we feel it in the stomach, we feel it in the heart, even though we can quite easily afford it, even though our earnings are far higher than our parents ever were, even though we never went through a depression. Very often as adults we are still suffering from this. The second type of negative habit pattern that we are heir to is what we call the compulsive negative habit pattern. And the compulsive negative habit pattern is characterized by the words, I have to, and is learned by the child when the child is made the recipient or the victim of what we call conditional love. When the parents make it clear to the child that he or she is not loved in and of themselves, but they are only loved when they do what the parent approves of. When the child is told over and over again, you'd better or else. If you don't, you're going to get it. Now look what you've done. You're in big trouble now. Or when the child does something or doesn't do something and the parents use the giving of love or the withholding of love as a tool to manipulate the child's behavior. The child subjected to this does not understand what is going on. The child is pure sensation, and the child only thinks, I am of no worth and value in and of myself. I am not safe and I am not secure, and my mommy and daddy don't love me unless I am doing what they approve of. Therefore, I have to win my mommy's and daddy's approval. I have to do what they want me to do. I have to please them. I have to conform to what they expect of me. This compulsive negative habit pattern leads very early in life to what we call the fear of rejection. The fear of rejection is demonstrated or manifested in an adult life by a preoccupation or an obsession with what other people think. We get to the point where we think continually, how are other people going to react? What will they say? What will they do? What did they mean by that? Why did they look at me like that? This compulsive negative habit pattern has its ultimate manifestation in type A behavior. The individual who suffers from true type A behavior is a person who is striving continually to try to gain the approval of their superiors in order to compensate for the fact that they never got the unconditional approval of their parents. And throughout our lives, these two negative habit patterns, the inhibitive, I can't, and the compulsive, I have to, and then the very worst of all, which is the double negative habit pattern, I can't, but I have to, but I can't. We feel driven to perform and we feel afraid to try, and we're caught in a negative bind. And these two negative habit patterns, I think, account for most of the failure that adults experience throughout the course of their lives. I feel that more adults have been held back from realizing their full potential as human beings by these two fears than by all the other fears combined in our psychological lexicon. We also know that it is destructive criticism predominantly that causes our negative habit patterns, that destructive criticism coming by someone having prestige to the child invariably lowers the child's level of self-esteem and the child's self-concept, that all destructive criticism decreases the child's ability to perform in a particular area. And children who have been severely criticized at a young age grow up to be hypersensitive as adults and become totally incapable of taking any criticism at all. I feel that destructive criticism is the great cancer that has probably destroyed more human personalities than all the wars of history. Destructive criticism, whenever it is used on an individual, whenever it is used on a child, does not cause the child to become better, does not improve the child's performance or effectiveness, but it has exactly the opposite result. When we talk to managers about these principles, we use the analogy of taking a sledgehammer to a piece of office equipment that is not functioning properly. Mostly when destructive criticism is used, the implicit suggestion is that if I criticize this person, or this child, or this employee, they're going to smarten up and fly right and do it better. We know from exhaustive research in behavioral psychology that when people are continually criticized for a particular type of action, they do not do the action better. What they do is they cease from engaging in the action completely. They avoid the action that causes the destructive criticism. It is better to take a sledgehammer to a piece of office equipment than to take destructive criticism to an employee. Because when you use destructive criticism on an employee, you so dramatically decrease their effectiveness that you are still paying the full salary or full remuneration to the employee, but what they have to contribute to the company is vastly diminished. Remember that negative habit patterns are conditioned responses to stimuli. They require a pattern of repetition over and over again, sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands of times for them to become firmly ingrained. And we can overcome negative habit patterns by beginning to feed our minds with new thoughts. And the most powerful thought we can use, of course, is I like myself. Now let me explain the difference between the conscious and the subconscious minds. We know that there is a tremendous difference in function between the conscious and the subconscious. The conscious mind, for instance, is the discriminating, rational, objective, thinking, analytical faculty of the human mind. The conscious mind is the only part of the human brain that thinks, that makes decisions, and that chooses actions. The role of the conscious mind is to take in information from the environment and to compare that information with previous experiences to determine whether or not it's relevant. It's to analyze that information to decide whether or not some action should be taken, and it is to make a decision. The conscious mind is always making a decision that is either yes or no. The conscious mind is either accepting or rejecting incoming information. Yet every single piece of information that the conscious mind accepts is accepted as a fact by the subconscious. The conscious mind can only hold one thought at a time, either positive or negative, either yes or no. But whenever the conscious mind says yes to a piece of incoming information, the subconscious accepts it instantly and reacts on it instantaneously. If I could give you an example, you're walking out between two cars onto a busy street, and you hear the roar of an automobile engine and a horn. You immediately turn to the right or the left and look, and you identify that it is an oncoming automobile. The second thing that the conscious mind does is it compares that oncoming automobile with all other moving automobiles to determine whether or not the automobile is relevant. If the automobile is a block away, then it is not relevant to one's actions and one continues at the same pace. If the automobile is 30 feet away, traveling at 50 miles an hour and is out of control, then it dictates a very careful analysis of one's situation standing there in front of it. The third step is that the conscious mind analyzes the various alternatives. Should I move forward? Yes or no? If the answer is no, then should I move backward? Yes or no? If the answer is yes, the instant that the conscious mind decides that I should move backward, it says, in effect, get me out of here. The entire subconscious operates the autonomic nervous system and all the muscles and nerves, and instantly we jump back out of the way of the car. We don't have to think carefully, now should I move my right foot back or should I move my left foot back? Or maybe I should move my right foot and then my left foot. We don't have to think about that at all. The instant that we say yes to moving out of the way of the car, the entire body reacts instantaneously. It's the same with certain thoughts. If we accept a fear thought, very often when we see something or hear something fearful, whether or not it is real, the instant that we accept that we are in danger or that we are exposed to a fearful event, once the conscious mind accepts it, the subconscious mind accepts it totally, and our whole body reacts instantaneously. That is why we can go from being in a state of complete relaxation to a state of total terror with the passing of 1 or 2 seconds. The key is the thoughts that we accept with the conscious mind. Now this brings us to 2 very important mental laws. The first of these 2 additional mental laws is what we call the law of concentration. The law of concentration simply says that whatever you dwell upon grows in your experience, that whatever you think about on a continuing basis becomes a part of you and a part of your experience. That you do become what you think about, and the more you dwell upon it, the more you concentrate upon it, the more you bring it into your life. The second law is what we call the law of substitution, which, because the conscious mind can only hold one thought at a time, either positive or negative, if we consciously and deliberately substitute a positive thought for a negative thought and keep our mind focused on positive thoughts and ideas, on the person we want to be with the attributes that we want to have, then that is what will grow in our lives, as opposed to the negative, which is what predominates in the majority of people's minds. The subconscious mind has a totally different function from the conscious. The conscious mind is the objective faculty, the subconscious mind is the subjective faculty. The conscious mind decides, the subconscious mind simply obeys. The subconscious mind is like a vast data bank. It's like a vast mechanical computer that stores and retrieves data, and that permanently records every single experience that we've ever had in our lives. It records every thought we've ever had, every decision we've ever made, every picture that we've ever formed in our imagination. And the role of the subconscious is to make all of our words and actions fit a pattern consistent with our self-concept and with our previous programming, so that we always walk, talk, act, think, and behave and perform in a manner consistent with the information that we have accepted as true in the conscious mind. All success begins with our taking systematic, purposeful control of the thoughts that we allow to occupy our conscious minds. That if we keep our conscious minds focused on where we want to go and what we want to accomplish, that is what begins to come into reality in our lives. And the most powerful thought that we can use in asserting full control over our conscious minds is, I like myself, I like myself, I like myself, I like myself, I like myself. Because of the law of concentration and because of the law of substitution, as long as we are thinking and saying, I like myself, and picturing ourselves as likable, attractive, high-performing human beings, it is impossible for any negative, discouraging, doubtful, skeptical thoughts to creep into our minds. The key to success is to take full control of the conscious mind, keep our conscious mind totally on what we want to accomplish, and to think continually, I like myself, I like myself, I like myself, and keep our minds focused on the things that we desire rather than the things we fear. This is the real application of the law of control and the beginning of all success as human beings. In the first session, we talked about the essential foundation characteristic of all success and achievement, which is a high positive self-concept and high genuine levels of self-esteem, self-acceptance, and self-liking. In this session, we're going to talk about the second foundation characteristic, the second quality of the two that is absolutely essential to all high performance and all high achievement. And we call this releasing your subconscious brakes, and it is based on an understanding of what has been termed responsibility psychology. We find that the role of parents is to bring us up so that by the age of 18 we are totally self-responsible, self-determined, self-reliant adults. To the degree to which our parents have achieved that, they have been successful, but irrespective of success or not, from the age of 18 onward, and often earlier, we are 100% responsible for the rest of our own lives. That the acceptance of total responsibility for our lives is the chief hallmark of the fully mature human being. Many people never understand this because we find that the great gap between immaturity and maturity is this acceptance of total responsibility, and the acceptance of total responsibility means that from then on in life, we have no more excuses. It has been said that excusitis, or the tendency to make excuses for our mistakes and failures in life, is one of the primary causes for failure as adults. The continuous making of excuses and trying to explain away our faults, our problems, and our deficiencies, instead of accepting full responsibility for our lives and doing something to change them, is one of the critical factors that holds people back from ever achieving their full potential as human beings. Irrespective of the success, irrespective of our upbringing, from the time we reach maturity onward, we are totally 100% responsible for our own lives and for everything that happens to us. Everything that we are at this moment and everything that we will ever be is totally under our own control, and we are totally in charge. From the time we reach maturity onward, we can never give away anything but control. We can give control to others, we can give control to other situations by trying to make someone or something else responsible for our lives, but we always maintain 100% responsibility. There are several areas in our society today where irresponsibility is encouraged in wholesale amounts. The first area I think of is in the area of political economy, where men and women have been encouraged now for several decades to try to get the government to assume responsibility for things in our life that are not satisfactory to us. All of the attempts to get the government to be responsible, to make the government do something, the government ought to pass a law, always end in frustration, because the government simply takes more and more control, but it always leaves us with 100% responsibility and 100% accountability for our lives. That is why the larger governments grow, the more frustrated and more unhappy their populations grow. For instance, in John Naisbitt's tape series Megatrends, he talks about the tremendous shift away from depending on large central governments to provide for our welfare, for the simple reason that it simply has not worked. It has culminated in endless taxation, endless regulation, enormous bureaucracies, and the lowest level of public services ever experienced by our population. We find today that the whole holistic health movement, which is really the only solution for escalating health care costs, is based on getting individuals to accept total responsibility for their own health. Many people do things to their health and to their bodies in the presence of an enormous medical establishment that they would never do if they didn't have doctors, pharmacies, and drugs to turn to. Remember the story of a man who reached the age of 103 years old, and a reporter came out to interview him and asked him if he had any regrets at 103 years old. And he said, "Only one," he said. "If I'd have known I was going to live this long, I'd have taken much better care of myself." And I think this is one of the critical variables in health. We find that people who accept total responsibility for their physical and mental health need far, far fewer visits to the doctor, far fewer, if any, drugs, and enjoy far, far higher levels of health. With regard to the acceptance of personal responsibility, many people pay lip service to it. Many people say that they think it's a good idea and they agree with it. And many people, as a result of hearing this tape or hearing someone else speak on this subject, will agree and decide that they are going to take responsibility in certain areas of their life. But in certain other areas, they simply don't feel it's necessary. And the most important point that we can make on this subject is this, is that the acceptance of total responsibility is not optional. For adults in our society, it is 100% mandatory. And not only that, it is not optional that we take responsibility in some areas and only partial responsibility in others. Irrespective of whether we accept it or not, we are 100% totally responsible in every single area of our lives. And there is no possible way of avoiding that. The acceptance of personal responsibility is terribly, terribly important for this very simple reason. If you can imagine a graph or a chart with a line running from the bottom of the page to the top, and on the top of the page we have a high degree of responsibility, and the bottom of this graph or chart we have a low degree of responsibility, or what we call irresponsibility. We find that on the top of the chart there is a one-to-one relationship between the acceptance of high degrees of responsibility for our life and our outcomes and the amount of control that we have in our lives. That we can never have more control over our lives, or more mental well-being for that matter, than we accept responsibility. We also find that there's a direct one-to-one relationship between accepting high levels of responsibility, experiencing a feeling of being totally in control of our lives, and experiencing the feeling of personal freedom. That we can never have more control than we have responsibility, and we can never have more freedom than we accept control. And there's a one-to-one relationship between responsibility, control, and freedom, and positive emotions. And since the key to happiness in life is to enjoy the greatest number of positive emotions over the greatest period of time, what we're really talking about here is how many positive emotions we enjoy on an ongoing basis. At the other end of the scale, the lower end, the scale of irresponsibility, we find that there is a direct relationship between an attitude of irresponsibility and a feeling of a lack of control and a lack of freedom over our lives. And there is a one-to-one relationship between feeling a lack of control and freedom and negative emotions. So what we're really talking about on this cassette is the difference between positive emotions and negative emotions. And the most astonishing discovery I have made in my adult life in the study of the psychology and the metaphysics has been that it is possible to eliminate negative emotions. That all negative emotions are unnatural to man. And even Freud wrote at the turn of the century that there is no permanent place in the subconscious for negative emotions. That every negative emotion we have, we had to learn by a process of repetition and reinforcement from a very early age, that it is possible to live without negative emotions. When I first understood that it was possible to live totally without negative emotions, what struck me more than anything else was that all the misery, all the unhappiness, all of the family breakdown, all the alcoholism and drunkenness and dope addiction, all the suicides and crime and violence in our society are rooted in negative emotions. Our research today demonstrates that virtually all of psychosomatic illnesses, ulcers and heart attacks and diseases as serious as cancer, plus arthritis and degenerative diseases that destroy the body and kill us far before our time, are all rooted in negative emotions, and it is possible to eliminate them from our lives. So in studying negative emotions, I'd like you to imagine a negative emotion tree. And in the negative emotion tree, there grows the predominant negative emotions of our age. And these are doubt, fear, guilt, resentment, envy, jealousy. There are about 54 negative emotions in the textbooks. But if you take them all and boil them all down, all negative emotions ultimately end up as anger, either inwardly directed or outwardly expressed. And there is a lot of nonsense in pop psychology today that suggests that negative emotions are somehow good, that it's okay to have negative emotions, it's okay to express your anger and tell people how angry you are, and the purpose of good mental health should be to learn how to cope with your anger and to deal with your anger and to tell other people about your anger and to live with your anger and so on. Now, the only thing I have to say to that is this: how do you feel when you're angry? Do you feel good when you're angry? Do you feel that this is a normal, natural, healthy, positive emotion that it's good to have and to enjoy and to express? No. The answer is that when you are angry, your whole system functions poorly. When you are angry, your ability to think clearly is often completely lost. It's like a black fog is thrown over your brain. When you're angry, you don't get along well with other people. When you're angry, you don't sleep properly. You toss and turn and grind your teeth. When you're angry for extended periods of time, you get stomach disorders and intestinal disorders. When you stay angry long enough, anger is the cause of high blood pressure. It causes your blood pressure to go up and to stay up, which is one of the leading causes of heart disease and death in our society. There is no redeeming feature whatever of anger. And the idea that somehow anger is good or at the very least necessary or a part of life is simply not true. The critical thing to understand about negative emotions is this, is that negative emotions are not caused from outside, that all of our negative emotions are within us, that every single negative emotion that we experience is our reaction to situations. It is not contained in situations themselves, and that all negative emotions are a sign of insincerity and weakness of character, that there is nothing noble, there is nothing admirable, there is nothing virtuous in having and expressing negative emotions. Not only that, it is possible by understanding where negative emotions come from to remove them and to cancel them and to eliminate them from our lives. So going back to the analogy of the tree, we have the trunk of the tree which goes down to the ground, and the tree has a root system which goes into the soil. Now we know that if you starve the root system of any plant or shrub of the nutrients it requires, that the plant or shrub will begin to die. In using the analogy of the negative emotion tree, if you starve the root system of the negative emotion tree of the nutrients it requires for survival, you will eventually kill the negative emotion tree and the negative emotions that grow in it. And the nutrients that are required for negative emotions are basically two. The first is what we call justification, that we can only experience negative emotions to the degree to which we can justify our right to these negative emotions. We tell ourselves and anybody else who will listen how entitled we are to suffer through this negative emotion because of what somebody or something has done to cause us to feel this anger. If we cannot justify the negative emotion, if we cannot explain to ourselves and to others that we are entitled to this negative emotion because of some event that has occurred, the negative emotion begins to die away. The second element that is necessary, or nutrient that is necessary for the negative emotion tree, is what we call the process of identification. We can only experience negative emotions to the degree to which we identify with the situation and take the situation personally. The most traumatic events can happen in the world that will cause us no negativity at all, and yet the smallest split in our fingernail or sore tooth or the slightest slight or bit of rudeness from somebody can cause us to be in pain and to be angry for hours and even days. We cannot suffer negative emotions unless we can justify to ourselves that we're entitled to them, and unless we take them personally, unless we identify with them personally. The instant that we stop justifying and stop identifying and taking things personally, our negative emotions begin to die. But if we go back to the negative emotion tree, we find that the fastest way to eliminate our negative emotions is to cut the tree down at the trunk. And the trunk of the negative emotion tree is blame. We find that it is not possible to have a negative emotion except by blaming someone or something else for a situation in our life that we find unsatisfactory. Every single negative emotion has as its root the element of accusation, of apportioning guilt, and of blaming someone or something else. The instant that we stop blaming, our negative emotions stop. And the instant that we stop blaming or cut down the negative emotion tree by slashing through the trunk of blame, all our negative emotions stop simultaneously. And the way that we stop blaming is that every single time something happens that causes us to feel angry or upset, we immediately use the law of substitution, recognizing that the conscious mind can only hold one thought at a time, and short-circuit the negative emotion by saying, I am responsible. I am responsible. I am responsible. I am responsible. The more we say, I am responsible, I am responsible, I am responsible, the more we assert complete control over our conscious minds. And as long as we are saying, I am responsible, it is impossible for a negative emotion to get rooted and to start growing in our minds. Remember that we are responsible in every case. As free individuals, we are responsible for every situation that we get ourselves into. And when we assert complete responsibility, we take total control over our conscious minds, and our minds go instantly calm and clear and positive. Next to I like myself, I am responsible is the most powerful positive affirmation that we can use to assert complete control over our thoughts, our emotions, and our destinies as human beings. I don't say that this will be easy. I've given this advice now to thousands of people, and I know that the first time you think of your pet negative emotion, the pet situation that makes you particularly angry, the particular individual that has offended you or hurt you, if you try to short-circuit the negative emotion by saying, I am responsible, the first time you say it, you're going to have to say it through gritted teeth. You're going to have to say, I am responsible, I am responsible, I am responsible. But it becomes easier as you repeat it more often. With regard to your friends, you will find that the kindest thing that you can do to other people who are experiencing difficulties or problems is to say, yes, I understand that you're having a problem, but you are responsible for your life. What are you going to do about it? You will find that those of your friends who genuinely want advice will be appreciative of your reminding them that yes, they are responsible, yes, they are in charge, yes, they are in control, and then they will start thinking in terms of what they can do about their situation. The others who complain and gripe and go on, week after week, month after month, year after year, who have no intention of ever making any changes, will soon stop talking to you if you continually remind them that they are responsible for their own lives. In any case, rather than getting involved in worry conversations and listening to hour after hour of people going on with all of their problems and their litany of ills, the fastest way to help your friends is to say, you are responsible, what are you going to do about it? It is the fastest way to build super kids and high-achieving young people. It's the fastest way to build high-performing employees. It's the fastest way to build human individuals by encouraging them continually to accept full responsibility for their own lives.